Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So in this video, we would be continuing our journey with lists in Python. This would be the second and last part for this specific video. And in this video, I will teach you guys how to loop through lists. Then I would teach you guys how to work with ranges in Python, then how to slice lists and copy them, and then even explore something new, such as tuples towards the end of the video. If you've already seen part one of this video, so this would eventually level up your skill set regarding lists in Python. So starting off with what are lists in Python, let me create my file. So I'll start off with looping in Python. So looping is generally a very important topic that one should know, because if you know how to loop, you'll make things easier for you when you're writing big programs. So generally, a general idea of why you want to loop through a list is, for example, you'll often want to run through all entries in a list, or you would have to perform the same task with each item. So for example, you make a game and you might want to move every element on the screen by the same amount, or in a list of numbers, you might want to perform the same statistical operation on every element. Or if you have a web page, you would want to display each headline from a list of articles. So to do the same action with every item in a list, you need to use a for loop in Python. So a general idea for this list, which I could think of, is a list of magicians, which I could create right here. And this list of magicians could hold names of different magicians, such as Alice. So now to generally use a for loop, I'll first of all I would write a for loop, and then I would explain how this for loop eventually works. So to write a for loop, I need to use the word for, and then I declare a variable. That variable could be of any name, for example, m in this case. Now for m in magicians with the name of the list, and then I put a colon. And then after that, I just need to perform the logic I want to do here. For example, I want to print every element in the list. So I would simply write print m magicians. So now this would print out all the elements in this list, as you guys can see over here in our terminal. So now I would be commenting out how does this for loop eventually works. So what we did was that we generally start off by defining a list. So we define a list, and then what we did was that uh, after defining the list, as I showed you guys how to do it in the previous video, we tell Python to generally print a name from the list that has been assigned to the list magicians, but we used a variable m. All right. So for that, uh, we define a for loop. By the way, let me just comment this whole block out. Yeah. So then we define a for loop, and then when I declared a variable m, so what this did was that this specific line tells Python to pull a name from the list magicians and associate it with the variable m. So uh, this line tells Python to pull a yeah. So this is what happened inside that line, and then after that, Python repeats that same line for each and every element in the same list. So and then to end this repeats uh, for every element. So for every element in the list, the data in the variable m would get modified with the new elements data that would be coming on for that specific element. Yeah, so this is how you use a for loop in Python, and this is what exactly the line number 3 and line number 4 means, so that you guys have a clear idea for how it works. And now we could also like associate a message inside a for loop or with every element that we are printing out. As I told you guys about f strings, as you guys remember for the previous video. So for example, rather than printing out the name itself, I could simply use an f string, and then I could simply first of all capitalize the first letter for each of the element that I am printing. And then what I could do is that I could tell that uh, this was a great trick. So now what this line means is that simply the first time through the loop, the value of magician is Alice. So Python would generally start the first message with the name Alice with its initial to be capital. And then for the second time, the message through will begin with David, and it would show the personalized message that we have assigned it. So now when I run this program, we can see that we have the name of the magician itself, and then we have a message associated with each of the magician inside that list. And this happens for all the magicians inside this list. So this is what exactly are for loops in Python, or what you want to do with loops in Python. And now to get outside this for loops, I want you guys to bring your attention to indentation. So now when I hit enter inside this for loop, you could see that our cursor is slightly indented towards the right. So this shows that you are inside this for loop. So any command you type over here would happen inside this for loop. But if I want to get out of this for loop, I need to either hit backspace so that my cursor gets aligned towards the leftmost side and I am out of the for loop, or you could simply use or simply you could change the position of the cursor using your mouse itself. So now as we are outside this for loop, I could simply print a message that this was a great show. So now this message which would print outside this for loop, and this would print only once after all the messages inside this for loop have been printed. So now when I run this program, I need to save it again. Yeah. So you guys can see that we have the commands that were inside the for loop, and then we have a print statement that was printed outside this for loop, and this would happen only once because it is not bounded by the for loop to be happen again and again for the number of elements in that list. Yeah, so now moving on, I would now like to bring your attention to specifically numbers and list of numbers and range function. Now, this topic is going to be a lot of much more interesting because as I told you guys that we are not bound to create a list of any data type, for example, string data type. We would also need numerical lists, and many reasons exist to store a set of numbers. For example, you need to keep track of positions for each character in a game, or you might want to keep track of a player's high scores as well. So lists are generally ideal for storing sets of numbers, and Python provides us a variety of tools to help us work efficiently with the list of numbers. So bringing your attention to what the range function is, this function. So the range function generally takes two parameters a and b, and what it does is that it generates a series of numbers, uh, but the numbers that would be generated from a till b minus 1. So for example, if you pass the range function parameters 1 and 6, so it will generate numbers from 1 up till 5. So the last parameter is not included in the set of numbers that are generated, or the series of numbers that are generated. So rather than creating a list and manually entering numbers from 1 to 4, for example, I would generally use the range function so that this part gets automatic, and I could simply use a for loop to print out the value. So for example, I could use a for loop, and then I could create a variable called value in its short form, and then in for value in range. So now this could be anything. You could either create a name of a list and then place the list's name over here, or you could assign it to the range function itself. And then later I will show you guys how to create a list automatically using the range function as a parameter. So for value in range 1 to 5, which will produce a series of numbers from 1 up till 4, what I want to do is that I need to print value. So now you guys can see that we have simply an output of numbers from 1 up till 4 using the range function. So in this example, range only prints numbers from 1 up till 4, and the range function causes Python to start counting at the first value you give it and stops when it reaches the second value you provided. So if I would, so if I were to use the parameters 1 and 6, so the output would start at 1 and end at 5 in that case. So now I would be showing you guys how to uh, use range to create list of numbers. So the general idea to creating a list using the range function is that you can convert the results of the range function directly into the list using the list function. So when you wrap the list function around the range function, the output will generally be a list of numbers. So if I were to create a new variable called numbers, and then I call the list function and wrap it around the range function and pass it the two parameters 1 and 6. So now this will produce a list of numbers rather than individual generation of numbers. So now when I print numbers, that would be the list of numbers from 1 up till 6, you could see that they would be in list form. So this is how you would generate a list using the range function by wrapping it around the list function. And now moving on to another important aspect of the range function is that I showed you guys that we could only take two parameters generally, but the range function could also take a third parameter, c in this case. So this parameter c acts as a step size. So by step size, I means it skips the number of elements you would pass it as. For example, if you pass it the parameters from 2 up till 11, which would generate numbers from 2 up till 10, and then you pass it a step size of 2, so it will skip numbers for the second part of the thing, and that would generate even numbers in that case. So now if I would like to create even numbers, uh, to make a list of even numbers, so I would simply create a variable called even numbers, and then I would call my list function and wrap it around the range function and pass it the parameters from 2 till 10 and with a step size of 2. And now when I print even numbers, it would simply give me a list of even numbers from 2 till 10. As you guys can see, that step size has efficiently removed all instances where the numbers were odd in this case. So we start. So now I would like to bring your attention to the two asterisks that are discussed in the first video. And as you guys remember that two asterisks represent exponents. So we could use a for loop coupled with the range function to generate a list of squares that would have squares of the numbers from 1 up till 10 in, for example. So two asterisks, so this represents exponents. So if we create an empty list called squares, and now I run a range, and now I run a for loop for the range. So for sq in range from 1 up till 11, because we want the squares of the first 10 numbers. So what I would like to have over here is that I would simply want sq to the power. By the way, we could simply append squares dot append sq to the power 2. Yeah, so now this would simply give us squares of the first 10 numbers, and now when I print squares, look, so now I have the squares of the first 10 numbers, 1, and then 2 to the power 2 is 4, 3 to the power 2 is 9, and then following on 9 to the power 2 is 81, and 10 to the power 2 is 100. So how did this happen? So you are now much familiar with how this statement at line number 13 works. So whatever the result for each number generated by the range function was, I just raised it to the power 2 and appended that result to my original empty list. So, and at last, I simply print out that list. And now this statement number 14, uh, this happened every time a new number was generated. For example, 1 to the power 2 for the first uh, time the loop was run, then 2 to the power 2 for the second time, 3 to the power 2 for the third time, and then 10 to the power 2 for the last time that loop ran for the number generated by the range function. So the loop would only work for this last parameter that it will have. So if you're using the range function, it would work till the last digit your parameter would be having, and if you have a list, it would run till the number of elements your list has. So this is a general idea how to use for loops with range function coupled in Python. So another thing is that you could simply have multiple functions in Python, such as minimum, and then we have a maximum function, and then we have a sum function. So as their name suggests, this would simply print out the minimum function. So this would simply print out the minimum number in a list, the maximum number in a list, and the sum of all the numbers in a list. For example, if I again create a list called numbers, and I pass it the list function and wrap it around the range function, and I create all numbers from 1 up to 10. So now what I would like to have is that I would like to have the minimum value out of all the list of numbers that I have created. I would simply write the print function, then pass it numbers, and I would pass it the minimum function, and then pass it the name of the list. So this would print out the minimum number in the list. Now for the maximum number, uh, it would simply give us the maximum number, which would be 10 in that case. And the sum would eventually be 55 in this case. Yeah, so as you guys can see, we have the minimum number throughout that list, which is 1. Then we have the maximum number, which is 10, and sum of all the numbers from 1 up till 10 is 55 in this case. So this is how lists work in Python. And now I would like you to bring your attention to the last thing for this numbers list is list comprehension. So generally a list comprehension allows you to generate the same list in just a single line of a code. So this is not something I would teach you guys as a beginner, but it is a good idea that you guys should know that what are list comprehensions. So a list comprehension would generally combine a for loop and the creation of new elements in the same line. And so, for example, as I showed you guys, this program from line number 12 to line number 15, in which we created squares of all the so in which we created the squares of the first 10 numbers in Python. So now if I were to use a list comprehension to combine all of these codes in these 3 lines into a single line, so I would simply use so how a list comprehension work is that you would simply need a name of a list, so list name, and then you use a square bracket. So for the square bracket, inside that, first of all, you write your logic, which was sq to the power 2 in our case, and then we use the keyword for, and then we declare our variable for which we run the for loop, and then simply pass it the range. So it is a really simple thing if you guys get a nick of it. So we could have another list, for example, sq to 10. So now this is the name of our variable. And then what I would do is that I would simply create my own variable, which would be s in this case. I would raise it to the power 2. So s to the power 2 for s in range 1 till 10, 1 up till 11 in this case. So now when I print sq to the 10, so I would get a list of numbers with all the squares from 1 up till 10, which would give us the same result which line number 15 gave us. So now when I run this program, you guys can see that we have the exactly same result as we have for line number 15 in this case. So list comprehension is comparatively more easy and more practical if you guys look at that way. Yeah, so now moving on to the last part of our video. So I will introduce you guys to slicing a list, copying a list, and after that we would have a intro to Tuples. Yeah, so for example, we have a list of players and I have multiple players in it. And would have names such as Charles, then Martina, then Michael, and after Michael, I would want to have 5 elements. So yeah, I could have Ellie, and Alice again. Yeah. So you guys can see that we have now a list of players, and now I would like to slice a list. So by slicing, what I means is that to make a slice, we specify the index of the first and the last elements we want to work with. So as with the range function, Python would stop one item before the second index you specify. So to output the first three elements of a list, I would like to request indices 0 till 3, which would return me the elements 0, 1 and 2. So I would simply print players and I will pass it two indices 0 and 3. So now this will give me the first uh, three items in this list, which are at index 0, index number 1, and index number 2. So now when I run this program, okay, so we have misspelled the name of the list. Yeah, so you guys can see that now we have the first three elements out of a list. So rather than printing out a complete list, we have sliced the list. So to use the slice function, we simply pass the list name, and then in the square brackets, we identify the indices we want to print. This returns elements from at index a till b minus 1. So this works the same as the range function, but instead of generating numbers, we are printing out elements out of a list. So this is a general idea of how you slice a list. And you could do it with uh, index number 1 up till index number 3 as well, which would give you elements number 2 and elements number 3, which are Martin and Michael in this case. So if you generally omit the first index in the slice function, so the Python automatically would start to slice at the beginning of the list. So if I remove this parameter 1 and have no parameter over here and I put 4 in this case, the Python will automatically start slicing from the first index, from the start of the list. You guys can see. Now we have indices number 0, index number 1, 2, and 3. So this is how slicing works in Python. And similarly, it would happen that if I pass the first index, for example 2 in this case, and I do not pass the last index, so now this slice function would print all elements from starting from index number 2, and it will work till the end of the list. So here's the result. From index number 2 we have Michael, then for index number 3 we have Ellie, and for the last index we have Alice in this case. And for example, now that we want to output only the last three players uh, from this list, so we could simply use the slice function and pass it in negative index uh, for the starting index. So for example, for the last three players, I would simply use -3 and then would not pass any other index at the last as a second parameter. So now you guys can see that we have the list elements of the last three elements in the list. And if I pass -2 right here, I would simply get the last two elements of the list. So this is how slicing works in the list. And we could also couple up slicing a list with the loop itself. So for example, I could print a statement that here are the first three players on my team, and then I could use a for loop and then slice it without passing the first index in specifying 3 as the last index, and then print player dot title. So for example, I could pass a statement that here are the first three members of the team. So for that, I would use a for loop, and I would not pass a first index and specify my last index to be 3, and I would simply want to print p.title. This will simply print out the first three elements, first three players in our list with initials to be capitalized. So you guys can see that we have our statement. I followed on with our entities in the list which we needed to be printed out in our case. So now moving on towards copying the list. So to copy a list, we would often want to start with an existing list and make a brand new list based on the first one. So to copy a list, we could make a slice of a list that includes the original list by omitting the first and the second index. So what? So if we pass the slice function without any index being specified, this will simply tell Python to make a slice that starts at the first team, that starts at the first item, and, and ends with the last item, producing a copy of the entire list. So for example, I could create a new list that would be a list for my foods, and inside that list I could pass on foods such as pizza, and after pizza we could add cake, and after cake we could add sandwich. So now we have created a list of my foods, and now if I would like to create another list, for example, foods that my friend likes. So, and I want my friend to have exactly the same foods which I like. So I would simply call my list and slice it without specifying an index. So now this list of friend foods, by the way, we should name it as friends food. So now this will have exactly the same elements that are in my list. So now when I print foods, we would have the same list as our original my foods list. Yeah, so you guys can see we have the same exact same list as. Yeah, so to normalize a syntax to be used for copying a list, I would simply call the list name, and then using the slice function syntax for using a square bracket, I would not specify an index in that case. So what this will do is that this will copy all elements in the list, and then you could assign it to any other list that you create, or you could simply just store it as an second list in which you would need to update anything, for example, scores of a game and etc. So now moving on to the last topic for this video, which is tuples in Python. So we already know that lists work generally very well with any data type or any data you have with them, but they have a ability to get modified. So the ability to modify lists is particularly important when you're working with a list of users on a website or a list of characters in a game. But we would generally want to create a list of items that cannot change. So tuples allow you to do just that. So Python refers to values that cannot change as immutable, and an immutable list is called a tuple. So tuples are generally a immutable list which can't be modified. So there's generally no difference regarding a list and tuple except the mutability of both of them. So a tuple would look exactly the same except that we use round brackets rather than square brackets to initialize a tuple. And once you define a tuple, you can access individual elements by using each item's index as you would do for a list. So for example, we have a rectangle and we have its dimensions, for example 250. So I should also tell you guys that for tuple we write tuple name and then we use square brackets and then pass it its relevant data. The major difference is that we use round brackets instead of square brackets, and that tuples are generally immutable in this case. So now when I want to print individual items at index 0 and at index number 1, this would work. Yeah, so I forgot to tell you guys that to print out elements in a tuple, we use square brackets, but to initialize a tuple, we use round brackets. Yeah, so the elements that we had in a tuple for index 0 and 1, you guys can see. So to print, we use tuple name, square brackets, and then pass it the index. Yeah, so if we were to generally change one of the items in the tuple, we would simply get an error. And basically, we are generally trying to alter tuple, but that cannot be done to that type of object because Python tells us that we cannot assign a new value to an item in a tuple. So I can show you guys, for example, if I were to change this, that rectangles 0 index should have the value 250 rather than 200. And then when I would like to print the item at index 0, I would simply get an error. We can see that. And that error type is that tuple object does not support item assignment. So you guys can see how strictness defined as a tuple in this case. So this would be it for this video, and I hope you guys to watch on to this complete playlist. And I would generally not be making videos that regularly due to my schedule, but I would be uploading videos for this course completely, and then I would generally make some cool projects such as creating a web server and creating a 2D game so that you guys also have a hands-on experience with what niche you guys want to work in with Python after learning object-oriented programming. So the next video would generally be on if, else, and while loops, and then we would start off with dictionaries and then classes and objects along with file handling, and I would generally create a separate video for that for Python 2. So do like, share, and subscribe, guys.